Hello and welcome back to CSIS. My name is Joseph Mikett, Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program. Thank you for accommodating us during a disruption, and we look forward to the second part of our conversation here on U.S. energy and climate leadership in a post-IRA world. I'm really excited for the second panel to talk about some of the more technical issues. I think it's important, however, to recognize that there are deep political issues here at play as well, as we've just seen. I'll just reiterate, CSIS believes very firmly in the rights afforded people in a democracy. We respect that there are a divergence of views on the kinds of issues we approach here at CSIS, and in particular when dealing with energy and climate change. It's important to recognize that the stakes of the issues that we face are quite large. So thanks again, everyone here today who's managed to stick with us. We really appreciate it. Let's actually talk about formulating leadership, however, because we can't solve this problem here in Washington, D.C., whether by protest or by conversation, but what we can do is inform the actions of people, not just in our country, but around the world, through technological innovation, through supplying better goods to consumers, and through providing for economic development that skips a couple steps when it comes to carbon intensity. That's what we really wanted to talk about today. I'm joined by Emily Fisher, who's Executive Vice President for Clean Energy at the Edison Electric Institute. Scott Moskowitz is the Senior Director of Market Intelligence at Q-Cells North America. And David Waskow is the Director of the International Climate Initiative at the World Resources Institute. Thank you all for being here today. Emily, I'd like to start with you. Just very briefly, we're 6 months in to the Inflation Reduction Act. Comes on the back of the bipartisan infrastructure law. From your perspective, from an EEI perspective, where do you see us most likely to see progress in the next couple of years in the drive to deploy clean energy, and what might stand in the way?
That's a great question. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conversation. What we're trying to do is move a massive energy system that has a lot of existing infrastructure upon which people currently rely. And I'm always really cognizant of the fact that energy is some of the most regressive in terms of pricing, right? So we have to have an affordable, reliable, clean transition. And I think that both the IRA, and I'm an IIJA person, not a bill person, so sorry if I use the acronym.
Technically correct, it's precise.
I don't know why we made that decision, but we went IIJA and not bill, so there you go. And we think that both of those pieces of legislation are going to be extremely important in moving that giant energy system more quickly. So the Edison Electric Institute is the trade association that represents all the investor-owned electric companies. I have 51 members who have voluntary forward commitments to reduce their emissions to zero or net zero. A lot of those commitments, I have one as early as 2035. I have a lot of them in the 2040s and one, a lot in 2050. And so I think these pieces of legislation have the opportunity to pull those goals forward. I had a lot of thoughts about what I thought the 2020s were going to look like in 2019. I'm sure we all did. One thing that I said, though, I'm sure, was that this was going to be the decade of renewables deployment. And I still think that's true. And I'm actually more excited about it in that I believe that the tax incentives that were included as part of the Inflation Reduction Act are really essential for helping us deploy more clean this decade. No one wants to talk about utility accounting, so I won't. But the way that those tax incentives are structured really allows my member companies to use them in ways that will allow us to accelerate our capital plans. So I had a bunch of members speak at CERAWeek 2 weeks ago in Houston, and all of them were talking about how their 5-year capital plans probably are 25% bigger than they were a year ago, and that's because of IRA. And that's, if you look at the queue of what's trying to interconnect with the larger grid right now, it's all wind, solar, and storage. And so these tax incentives are going to do what I said. They're going to help us go a little bit faster, and they're really going to meaningfully help reduce the cost to customers. To highlight some of the challenges, which I think you'll probably delve into with some of my colleagues here, I did sort of glibly say, this will be the decade of renewables, and that'll be fun, and we'll deploy a lot of them. I do think supply chain challenges have the potential to make that not be as accelerated as I would hope as a result of the legislation. I think access to solar panels is a pretty big deal. I think concern about the ability to, for example, purchase electrolyzers. We have a lot of focus on hydrogen right now. There's also, it's really difficult to, I think there's a significant backlog in electrolyzer availability. So supply chain issues, trade issues, I think those could be impediments that I had really not envisioned when I thought about this decade or when we thought about what IIJA and the IRA could do.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so supply chains, perfect setup, by the way. Scott, you are working for a company that is trying to supply solar cells made in the United States, I think primarily for the US market. $2.3 billion investment in a factory in Georgia. Talk to us a little bit about setting up a virtuous cycle between manufacturing and deployment, not just in the IRA period, but going forward.
Sure. Thank you, Joseph, and good to be here. Nice to see you all. Yeah, so Q-Cells, we're one of the world's largest diversified clean energy companies, joint headquartered in Korea and Germany. And just 2 months ago, we announced the largest investment in U.S. solar industry history of any kind, a $2.5 billion clean energy supply chain investment to manufacture solar wafers, cells, modules down in Georgia. A couple of those items are not made in the United States at all at the moment, so this is really establishing a new critical supply chain here in the United States. We also announced a 10-year supply agreement to get polysilicon for that factory from Washington State, which of course is going to be using a factory that is powered by low-carbon hydropower. So we are really focused on looking at the supply chain from end to end and trying to figure out how to get as much low-carbon manufacturing into the U.S. market as possible. But I've been working in the industry for a decade. This is a huge change, right? We have seen this industry scale and scale and scale, and two things have tended to be true in most clean energy sectors, but particularly in solar, which is that prices usually fall faster than people expect, and demand usually rises faster than people expect. Most folks, the solar industry is a 150 to almost 200 gigawatt annual market now. That's bigger than most folks would have imagined a couple of years ago. However, over the last 3 years, that's all been flipped on its head. Between COVID, general supply chain issues, trade disputes, and other things that have really shown all of us what our global supply chains look like. It's really changed how things look. And so the Inflation Reduction Act came at a really perfect time. And frankly, without it having passed, it's really hard to see how any of these problems would have been solved in the long term. So now we have a market that it makes sense to make investments like this in the United States. We've got production-based manufacturing credits that are basically the first go at industrial policy that we've seen in a really long time. There are adders on things like the investment tax credit, which has been around for a couple of decades, passed and supported and extended under both Republicans and Democrats, but now extended for 10 years with adders that push people towards buying domestically. And those two things really create this really strong environment to invest in U.S. manufacturing. You've seen more investments in the last 6 months than you have in the last 20 years, at least in this particular sector. And we think that's really great. There's a long way to go. Progress is incremental, and this is a big step, but we still have way more demand for renewables than we have supply. But to your question of what is this virtuous cycle, I think you see that when you have big manufacturing industries to support, it creates political capital, it creates will to build these industries up further. And one of the reasons that you look at a country like China, which is both the world's largest manufacturer of clean energy, but also the world's largest installer of clean energy, is partially because they have this big manufacturing sector to support. So I think these investments help create this healthier, diversified landscape that should help accelerate the market going forward.
Excellent, thank you. And David, I'm really grateful you're here because it's very easy, like all Americans, we get caught up in our own business. But when you look at the climate future, it's emissions around the world that matter. And the IRA does a lot for domestic decarbonization, for deployment of low carbon energy, but doesn't have much to say about the international picture. So from your perspective, how should we be thinking about realizing the potential of the IRA in a more international context?
Great, thank you, and great to be here. I'll start just by saying that I think the IRA got the U.S. back in the game internationally in a way that if it had not passed, would have been real trouble. And it can get us 40% reductions by 2030, which is a decent part of the way we have to go to 50%, which is the commitment that the U.S. made, that the Biden administration made under the Paris Agreement. So critically important from that perspective. But I do also want to touch on 4 things that I think are important elements of the legislation and also the bill or IIJA. And I think they should be seen as paired in a lot of ways. So first is green industrial policy, which Scott referred to. And this really has been a shift in the way that U.S. policymaking is made, and a real focus on figuring out where, both from a climate perspective and an economic perspective, the U.S. really needs to make some key bets. The EU is now, at least tentatively, seeming to follow some of that path. They in part got upset about it, but also have begun following that path. And I think we can see it in broader terms as well, that it can translate into a green development policy. And that's the kind of thing that the World Bank, for example, really needs to take hold of and move forward. So that's one. The second one is about innovation. And one of the most important things we can do as the United States is to innovate in ways that then can spread globally. And 2 things in particular I would point to. One is the incentives for advanced manufacturing in heavy industries. So that's steel, cement, aluminum, and really moving that agenda forward. Those are generally considered hard to abate sectors, hard to tackle. But I think that those resources are going to push innovation forward and provide benefits in the form of innovative approaches to the rest of the world. I would note green hydrogen in that basket as well. Third is diversifying supply chains. And I don't think this has to be seen in a kind of anti-China mode. We just have to recognize that the amount of critical minerals, the amount of batteries, solar panels, et cetera, and I think we just heard some of this in the US context, we just don't have enough for what we are going to need if we're going to keep temperature change to 1.5 degrees, or even just to meet the demand that's out there. So diversifying supply chains is really about making sure that globally we're able to produce what we are going to need. And then fourth, very quickly, is on environmental justice and just transition. And here, the administration has been engaged in some really interesting innovations, a screening tool that allows you to see where disadvantaged communities are and where the investments on clean energy, on energy efficiency, et cetera, need to go. The IRA sort of reinforced, it complemented that approach. And I think that this is an approach that other countries can look to. It's not something that's really in this way been done elsewhere, including in the EU. So this is something where the US is pressing forward. The last thing I'll just note is that this concern about disadvantaged communities is really something that we also need to have as a principle beyond our borders, not just in the United States. Unfortunately, we've done a very poor job on actually providing the kinds of finance that's needed for developing countries to be able to reduce emissions and to build their resilience to climate impacts that we're facing. So we have a job to do on that front in order to have the kind of international credibility that I think we should all want.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so one thing that we're trying to do here as we think about this kind of position of U.S. leadership is to think about what services our country provides the world as it moves towards decarbonization, right? And when you look at a post-IRA world, and I guess this is actually a question for the field, what is it that we have to offer? The money we're going to spend here, right? IRA is domestic tax credits, it's adders for labor here, for manufacturing here. There's a lot of innovation that can occur, but what do we need to add that really helps approach the global problem? Or Scott, maybe I should be more bullish. Are we going to be a solar panel exporter 15 years from now?
It's really possible. I'll just go to the last question. I mean, it's 40, 50 gigawatts a year of solar is probably what's being demanded. Not nearly as much of that is getting installed because, again, we've got supply chain constraints and more investments need to get made. But it's a different conversation now than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago in solar and a lot of other clean energy technologies, the only thing that mattered was getting the cost down. It was too expensive. Solar panels were $2, $3, $4 a watt. And now solar is just about as cheap. It's the cheapest form of energy in most places around the world, even when it's made locally. So there's no fundamental disadvantage that a country like the US has. We have access to materials. We have access to advanced engineers and knowledge and all these things. We know how to manufacture this stuff. And so, yeah, you can see a world where once we hit once these investments come into play and scale up and become globally competitive, yeah, 5, 10 years from now, we could definitely be exporting.
And do you think that competitiveness comes from new technologies? Does it come from process innovation? Does it come from us just getting better at building the stuff that we need at scale?
Both. There's a feedback loop here where when you have manufacturing, it creates local R&D, and you learn a lot from the manufacturing itself, probably more than you would learn in a research lab, right? Products are constantly iterating and getting better. So that, you definitely will get some of that. But at the same time, there's a bunch of R&D grants and credits within CHIPS, IIJA, the IRA. There's a lot of different ways that this could play out and help.
So one of the things you need to demonstrate leadership is competence. And one of the promises of an energy transition, one that hinges a lot on electrification, is we can produce a lot of inexpensive power, it's going to be cleaner, it's going to redound to the benefit of consumers. Emily, what stands in our way of making sure that happens in the US? Because the narrative is places with a lot of renewables suffer reliability challenges, high costs, and maybe thinking wayward in their energy planning. So how does the US over the next 7-8 years really demonstrate that this can work for a modern, high output economy?
I think that's a great question. I don't necessarily agree with that framing, although I know that framing is common. I think there's no question that we will run a highly resilient clean energy system. I spend a lot of time with engineers, and the amount of clean, zero-emitting resources that we can integrate into the grid today would shock people even 5 or 10 years ago, right? You would have conversations I don't know if we can run a system on 10% wind, that seems crazy. And we obviously do more than that now. I think recent resilience and reliability challenges are not exclusively related to renewables. In fact, sometimes renewables are the solution to those challenges. I think all fuel sources have demonstrated to us in the last 12, 18, 24 months that they can have challenges under the what I'll say wrong conditions. Winter Storm Uri was a failure of the natural gas supply system. So everything has its challenges. That's one of the reasons why we're big advocates of a diverse mix of resources, right? So I believe that we're going to deploy a lot of renewables, and there will be a large amount of our electricity that does come from renewables. But we're really focused on the technologies that I think IIJA are going to help us demonstrate that are zero-emitting 24/7 technologies. So in electricity wonk language, we call that dispatchable, and that means you can turn it on when you need it. And so we have a real big focus on clean hydrogen, CCS, advanced batteries, including long-duration energy storage, advanced nuclear, and advanced renewables. I think one thing that didn't really get covered by either of those two pieces of legislation was geothermal. That has a ton of potential, particularly on the heating side. So, I think we have the potential to run a clean, reliable system. We do need to demonstrate some of these clean, zero-emitting 24/7 technologies, and I think one of the benefits of IIJA in particular is just the amount of resources the federal government has put behind demonstrating those technologies and bringing them to market at cost and at scale. The amount of excitement on the hydrogen side is kind of intense. It's a very rich tax incentive, but if you do it right. And I think just to piggyback onto one of your answers, I think it's sort of a fascinating conversation for us. Are we going to be exporters of clean hydrogen? And that's not something, at least from electric companies, usually don't do a lot of exporting of the product. We have, some connections into Mexico and Canada, but often the the flow is from Canada, not to Canada. But the idea that we would be the producers of an energy product that gets exported to the world to help countries, particularly in Asia, that might not have access to the renewable resources that we do is an interesting and different sort of a view of what the future looks like.
Not an unfamiliar concept for our friends in the oil and gas industry, but something
Feels weird
that
to me,
our
though.
clean energy people are getting on board with. The question was really meant to kind of poke at how we build the system, not the sources, right? So NREL published this study last week showing that under IRA, 90% of our power could come from clean sources by 2030. They had a side case in that study that is the constrained case, right? Here, electricity transmission is hard to build. CCS infrastructure is difficult to build. And we don't realize the potential of the IRA. So maybe we could kind of think about, like, Congress is talking about permitting reform. The administration wants to talk about permitting reform. We were hoping we could talk to them about permitting reform today. What are your views on how we crack this nut, right? How do we reach agreement in either in the administration or in Congress that the U.S. really needs to build stuff, and when we build stuff, it's primarily going to be clean?
Yeah, sorry for being a generation person at heart. And so I took the bait on the generation side. Obviously the expansion of the transmission system is going to be pretty critical for us to achieve ambitious 2030 clean energy goals. Credible studies of what it would take to have a clean economy in 2050 say that we would need to expand the transmission system 2 or 3 times. Some discussion that we would need at least a 60% expansion by 2030. Given the fact that right now, I would say it takes on average at least 10 years to build new interstate transmission in the US, those things seem misaligned. And I think a lot of folks have taken a look at the benefits of the clean energy tax incentives and said we will lose those if we don't figure out how to expand the transmission system. So it is a really relevant conversation on the Hill right now. What can we do to accelerate that process, and how can we support that from a cost perspective? So, we're pretty engaged in a conversation about the siting and permitting process, particularly the environmental review process. It can take an extremely long time. Secretary Granholm went to a ribbon cutting on the 10 West project. I think that was the very end of February. The environmental review for that project took 5 years and cost $5 million. I think if we're trying to build transmission quickly, that's probably too slow. And then I'm also a lawyer, and so I'll tell you almost all of those things end up in litigation, and that also is a fairly large, I will say, derailment of the process. So I think looking at some common sense ways to accelerate that process to ensure that it is robust and that stakeholders are involved, but that we are able to, as you said, actually build things is pretty critical. A lot of the conversation has been focused on the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the basis for the environmental reviews that I was talking about with Secretary Granholm. Can we make that more efficient? Can we give the government the resources it needs to go faster? Can we give them some incentives to go faster? Do we need to put some shot clocks on how long this takes? I'll just say one of my interests is that we have a transmission planning process. It's run by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That process and the environmental review process do not appear to have any relationship to each other. And so FERC is the expert on that. It comes out of some fairly robust processes that involve a lot of stakeholders. I'd love to see the environmental review process acknowledge the value of that, and that has been, and that the expertise of FERC, when we say this line is necessary, that we are able to rely on that as a way of sort of moving through that process a little bit more quickly.
Are you proposing a negative Scope 3 emissions evaluations?
I'm not doing that. I actually think that we have a good story to tell on all emissions, right? I think transmission helps the entire power sector reduce emissions. It helps the rest of the economy reduce emissions. I'm not concerned about a greenhouse gas emissions analysis related to a lot of infrastructure. I think we have positive stories to tell.
Also reduces costs and increases resilience.
All good stuff.
Scott, from a company that's on the manufacturing side of this problem, what stands in the way of building a lot more solar factories or battery factories, if you can kind of infer? Is it workforce issues? Is it siting and permitting? Is it setback rules in any particular state? How should we think about that challenge? And before you answer, colleagues in the room, we do have time for a couple questions. If you'd like to line up at the microphone over here, try to take a couple of them if you're interested. Please.
Yeah, that's a good question. Workforce is definitely top of mind for everyone. We're hiring 2,500 people in Georgia over the next 2 years in a 3.5% unemployment economy, right? So that's a challenge. You got to find folks that can be trained on the job, engineers, there's operators, technicians, everyone from there's something for everyone in factories like this. But I think there's also a leg up in that these are the kinds of industries that presumably will be around for a long time. They're exciting. Folks want to be a part of it, so we definitely have that going for us. But yeah, I think that I don't know. Let's see. This market's growing so quickly that it's exciting. Wow, I'm mumbling words because I'm losing the point of the question. But
can we build stuff fast enough, and not just like on the consumer side? Can we build the infrastructure necessary to achieve whether it's the administration's goals or the IRA, right? This kind of do we have the mojo for industrial policy?
Yeah, I think for a company like us, these are investments, at least in the United States, that we've never made at this scale before. So we still have to figure out, are they going to work? Is there going to be demand for this to a degree that we can compete with companies producing in low-cost environments that are scaled up, and it's a complex, very high-pressure, intense market. So, I think the big thing that we'll see from a policy perspective is, again, these adders in the on the investment tax credit are new, and they're currently being worked out in terms of how they're going to be guided. They could be around for a long time because, you talk about studies that say 2030 is like, we're looking more probably on a 2040, 2045 type timeline, and within the Inflation Reduction Act, that's how long some of these tax credits can be. It's until 2032 or until there is 75% reduction in emissions. So there's a long time period here, and if these policies can be administered in the right way, it's really going to keep boosting folks to invest and really supply a lot of this demand. And then you get to this point where you actually do meet those targets, then all of a sudden it really starts to matter. What is Mexico doing? What is South America doing? What's Africa doing? Because all of a sudden the US will be in this place where we have these huge industries that have really supplied domestic demand, and then we have a global market to look at. So it creates a lot of opportunity. We'll see how things play out in the next 5 years.
David, how do we create conditions that global marketplace that Scott's talking about is going to be ready to accept the supply that the US economy might be able to provide 10, 20 years from now?
Well, I think the key to that is continuing to work across the board with all countries on enhancing what they're doing on climate issues. And I think we see, the commitments under the Paris Agreement, for example, that essentially every country wants to build a more robust renewable energy system. They want to reduce emissions from transport and build out, I think in developing countries particularly, build out their public transport systems, especially with an eye to electrification. They want to make their food systems more sustainable. So I think that if the supply emerges at that scale, I think the demand will be there around the world. I think one of the questions in the near term is how quickly, to sort of piggyback on your question, how quickly we can build out some of this production infrastructure in the U.S. And there's some quite aggressive goals, in fact, in IRA, particularly on critical minerals and batteries. Yeah. And so to get there, I think there's really going to have to be a concerted effort. And I'm not sure that we've collectively really come to grips with the degree to which that will need to be pushed forward.
And that leads me to like one final theme. We think a lot about this concept of leadership and the U.S. sort of jockeying now with China across a wide variety of areas of technological innovation and working for global influence. Clean tech is a place where we've definitely lost a step. So how do you think, David, and then we'll come back this way, on this idea that climate is now going to be part of geopolitical contest, right? How do we work together? How do we find the right places to compete?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, for a long while, we had, wanted climate to be right there in the center of the table for the G7 or the G20, and it is now. But in a sense, be a little bit careful what you wish for. I think it's all good, but the dynamic now is sort of bound up in broader geopolitics. I think what's particularly interesting, though, is that rather than it being a competition, if you will, about who has to reduce emissions by when and how much, it's a competition about who can get to the front end of producing renewables, producing EVs, et cetera. So it's geostrategic now, but in a very different way, I think.
Yeah, one might argue that we were playing different games for the last 8 years, and now the U.S. has finally caught up. Sky, your company provides a counterexample, right? Making investments in the U.S. How does a big global company think about that challenge?
It's funny, to the argument of U.S. leadership and where we are in this. Like, I couldn't agree more with you in that, I've been working in this industry for a decade. For a long time, it really seemed, how is the U.S. going to compete in this sector? How are we going to scale up? How is this transition going to happen in a way that was healthy and really creating an environment for everyone to succeed in? We still have a long way to go in that, right? Fortunately, there are a couple of big companies, global diversified firms, that are starting to make these investments in the U.S. We've seen a lot of other things going on over the last 6 months, but really long way to go. We'll see if the U.S. can catch up and if we can really help start to meet some of these targets that we have. But we're thrilled. A year ago, it might not have been possible to make these types of investments. It is now, and that's a big shift.
And Emily, lastly with you, I mean, it's a great story. We're going to build all this stuff in the U.S. We're going to be an engine of innovation. The reality is these supply chains rely heavily on China or upstream materials from China. When you think about the consumer side of this, right, the service provider side, how can we thread the right balance between providing good services at low cost right now versus making these investments that the administration and Congress would like to see?
I mean, we're certainly supportive of onshoring and friendshoring more of our supply chain, but I don't think we ever think that our entire supply chain will come exclusively from the United States. So we need strong, resilient partnerships and the ability to take advantage of developments that happen in other places. I mean, I think it's super important that we do proof of concept in the electric sector here in the US. And continue to strive toward increasing amounts of renewables and other clean energy deployment, and that we can then sort of be a model for others. But I'll tell you right now, the Europeans are a little bit ahead of us on renewable integration, so I think there are things we can learn from them. EEI has actually, I think, 90 international member companies from 70 countries, and we are more integrated in our policy. This is a little bit of a parochial answer to your question, but we are more integrated with other electric companies in other countries now than we have been in my entire 15-year tenure at EEI, because I really think we have things that we could learn from each other. I do think that we will be in competition for each other to get at the solar panels, because there will not be enough in the near term. But I think we got to make incremental progress on the supply chain and then partner where we can to learn how to do this right and take the best examples and share them. So, other energy systems are operating differently and have taken different approaches, and I really think it's a fruitful time for cooperation. And certainly also supporting, Europe has a great amount of renewables deployment, a little bit more than we do right now, but we've got to help them figure out how to manage a transition away from Russian gas. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from each other.
Yeah, they've also done some really interesting things on permitting and siting that we might get inspired by.
There might be some things we could learn from them on that too.
Unfortunately, we have to admit it. I think we can close our conversation. We've reached the time. Thank you, everyone, for coming, to our speakers, for continuing to participate with us today and offering your insights, and for everybody who joined us in person and online. Thank you very much. But this is CSIS signing off.